You are Niko Belik, correct?
What is this?
And you used to work the coast in the Mediterranean, smuggling people into Italy.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But you messed up.
He might be one of the most notorious traitors in Grand Theft Auto history. The man who sat in the background while Roman's life spiraled down the drain. His hands were behind almost every bad thing that happened to Roman. His cab depot being burned down, his apartment meeting the same fate. Roman also suffered beatings, threats, kidnappings, torture, and depending on how things played out, even his death. Dimitri Rascalov is one of the most hated men in Grand Theft Auto 4, and it's not hard to see why. But for all of the anger that surrounds his name, there's another side to him that's often overlooked. He wasn't just reckless or unhinged, he was methodical, cold, intelligent. Dimitri was someone who knew how to sit still and observe, and then strike when the timing was perfect for him. He understood how to take loyalty and twist it into leverage, how to make survival look like sacrifice. Nowhere is that clearer than in what happened to Mikhail Faustin. Faustin wasn't just Dimitri's boss, he was his closest friend. They came up together. They immigrated to the United States together. But when Mikhail started losing control, picking fights with much more powerful and better organized people, Dimitri didn't really try to stop him, he just let it happen. Watched him go off the deep end. And when the damage had piled up too high, Dimitri stepped in. Not to save him, but to bury him. He made it look like his hands were tied, that he had no other choice. He convinced Niko, a newcomer who didn't know any better, to pull the trigger. To believe this was just business, just another mess that had to be cleaned up. And then, he turned on Niko. What was supposed to be a simple meetup in an abandoned warehouse, just payment for a job, turned out to be a setup. Dimitri wasn't there to settle with debts, he was there to hand Niko over to someone else, Ray Bulgarin. That moment is of course one of Dimitri's most obvious betrayals. It's right there, plain as day, but what most people don't see are the quieter moves. The ones happening behind the scenes, the business deals, the backdoor arrangements, the steady flow of betrayal stitched into the fabric of his rise. Every relationship Dimitri had eventually became leverage, every ally expendable, and that's how he tightened his grip on Liberty City. His name started turning up in places it didn't belong. Boardrooms, clubs, council chambers. It didn't matter if you were a street-level dealer or someone like John Gravelli from the old guard. Dimitri was a problem, a threat. He wasn't interested in traditional respect, he just wanted control over the city. Today we're going to be stepping back, looking not just at the man Dimitri became, but where it all started. Everything he and Faustin had built in the Soviet Union in the 80s, covering what they established here in Liberty City in the 90s, and how after Faustin was killed, Dimitri kept it all running, and then expanded it. While the mafia families tore each other apart, Dimitri also quietly moved beneath them, exploiting the fractures they were too proud to notice. He saw the Ancelottis for what they were, stretched thin and fighting on multiple fronts. They were at war with the Pegorinos, clashing with the Messinas, encroaching on Gambetti turf, and fending off what was left of the Irish mob. It was never a proper alliance. They were a tool that Dimitri used. He utilized them to apply pressure, to draw fire, and to bleed on his behalf. And when they outlived their usefulness, he pivoted again, shaking hands with none other than Jimmy Pegorino, a man whose ambition far outweighed his influence. Through it all, Dimitri kept climbing, deal by deal. It wasn't always loud or flashy, but lethal in how methodical he was. And if it wasn't for a few things going differently, Dimitri might have pulled it all off. He might have taken Liberty City without firing another shot or anyone properly knowing how under his leadership, the Russian mob was practically everywhere. This video isn't about just a traitor, it's about the long game Dimitri played and how close he came to winning it.
It wasn't always like this. Mikhail was a great man. He had a temper, but he was fair.
Where's Dimitri? Let me tell you something. Me and this guy, we were in the army together. We were in prison together. We are like brothers.
Dimitri's story doesn't begin in Liberty City. It begins all the way back in the Soviet Union. Like many characters in Grand Theft Auto 4, the exact details are hard to pin down. Dates are vague. Backstories come in fragments, thrown out during arguments or hinted at in conversations. But based on what we know, especially from what Mikhail says in some of his more unfiltered moments, we can start to piece things together. What's clear is that Mikhail and Dimitri met while serving in the Red Army during the Cold War. It was a bond forged not in friendship but in survival. After their time in the military, the two of them ended up in a Siberian prison, where conditions were brutal and power meant everything. According to Mikhail, that's where he protected Dimitri, kept him from being beaten, humiliated, raped. He saw something in Dimitri that was worth defending. Or maybe he was still that good, honest man that his wife remembers him as being, and that was the person that was defending Dimitri. Years later in Liberty City, Mikhail had become dangerous, paranoid, sociopathic, with no filter and no concern for consequences. But even then, even at his worst, there was still a few things he valued above all else: loyalty, honesty, and usefulness. Those are the very reasons why he immediately held Niko in such high regard. As he already admitted multiple times, he didn't care about what happened to him. Add that to the fact that he was a trained killer and only cared about the bottom line of getting paid. As long as it didn't potentially put his cousin's life at risk, Niko was by all accounts the perfect enforcer who didn't have any time for any additional questions. The passage of time may have eroded Faustin's more nuanced nature, but that version of him remained, which in turn gives us insight into part of his character back when he met Dimitri. Given Dimitri's appearance and how he's the submissive one between the two of them, it's a little more difficult to concretely say if he's changed as drastically as Faustin apparently has, according to both Dimitri and Faustin's wife. But the reason why that's important is because it does leave some room for skepticism on if he was always the cold manipulator he is proven to be while in Liberty City, or if that's just a side of him he's cultivated perfectly over the years. If that's purely him or not, from day one, I'll leave for you to decide. Whatever the full truth is, we know this much. They met in the military. Their time in prison only brought them closer, and somewhere in that shared hell they made a vow, one they marked with a tattoo on their palms. It became a symbol that meant they were brothers for life. When the Cold War ended in 1991, both Mikhail and Dimitri turned to street-level crime. They began selling hashish to tourists in Red Square, Moscow. It was a bold, reckless, and extremely dangerous move. But what's interesting though, is by then both men had multiple murder convictions on their records, which suggests that their criminal lives may have started well before their prison sentence even began. In fact, it's quite possible that's what landed them in Siberia to begin with. Whether they served time as soldiers who crossed the line or gangsters already neck deep in blood, we don't know. But what is clear is that by the time they left Russia, they were already hardened men. And that turning point came in the 1990s. At some point during the 90s, Mikhail saw his chance. There was a loophole within the US immigration treaty which gave him an opportunity to slip through the cracks and start over inside of Liberty City. It wasn't a clean break, but it was just enough to get in. And he didn't come alone. He brought his wife, their young daughter, and Dimitri, always close behind, made the move with him. By the time they immigrated to the United States, what tied Mikhail and Dimitri together wasn't just a friendship anymore, it was history, business, the loss of shared blood. They had survived the Soviet collapse, prison, war, and now building something new together. Mikhail wasn't just settling down either, he was laying the groundwork for a future, and soon, others from the Soviet Union followed. One by one, the same men who had stood beside him back in Russia would arrive in Liberty City. These men were not good, honest, working citizens. They were trusted foot soldiers within Mikhail's empire back in Soviet Russia. They were all old associates. They planted themselves in Hove Beach, just blocks from Mikhail's home, and created a smaller, more controlled version of the world they left behind in the Soviet Union. Described like this, it can feel less like an immigration and more so like a resettlement, starting out as a slow, steady claim over a small section of the city. And at the center of that was Mikhail and Dimitri standing side by side. From here, the details get murky again, so we are stepping into uncharted territory. But if we follow the pattern, it's safe to assume their operations only continued to grow once they landed in Liberty City. And while Mikhail would eventually spiral into the violent, short-tempered sociopath we met in GTA 4, it's likely that in these early years, he was far more measured, level-headed, calculated, and focused on building something that's much more sustainable. Still, their criminal history didn't exactly fade into the rear view. In 1998, both Mikhail and Dimitri were arrested on extortion charges. 2 years later, Dimitri would be picked up again, this time for hijacking. And by 2002, Mikhail was back in handcuffs as well, charged with possession of stolen property. Whatever calm they have started with, if they did at all, it didn't last. The records followed them into the States, and with each arrest, each charge settled more and more into the pattern that we would eventually find a few years later through the lens of Niko. But here in these early days, they were still just trying to carve out a piece of whatever they could by any means necessary.
That's the way it works. I am angry. You are calm. I scare you easily. It works.
Yes, but you've angered the wrong people. Too many bodies, too much attention will be dealt with if we don't start playing by the rules.
I don't want to talk about Dimitri's manipulation of Niko directly, but more so his mentality for taking over from Faustin, and the position he was in after doing so, because Dimitri's sudden rise through Liberty City's underworld after killing Faustin didn't happen in a vacuum. His success, which felt almost overnight, can be traced directly to the foundation Faustin has spent years building, with Dimitri's help. Together they took the money from their growing list of criminal ventures and funneled it into more legitimate-looking fronts. Most notably, the Perestroika Cabaret. Nestled within their own corner of the city, it gave Faustin a public face, a sense of class, and a place to launder money behind velvet curtains. Around the same time, they would open up Comrade's Bar, which was a rougher, more grounded hangout that quickly became a hub for Faustin's crew. Over time, Comrade's would eventually be handed off to Vlad, where he would take over day-to-day operations and use it as both a base of power and a place to throw his own weight around. But these two establishments weren't just places to drink or dance. They were physical manifestations of Faustin and Dimitri's growing empire, which could have went even further had it not been for Faustin's decline. Now, for the sake of not repeating what was already deeply covered in Faustin's video, the bottom line here is sometime between his 2002 arrest and meeting Niko in 2008, Faustin's mental state had been on a steady decline, with his temper only growing more explosive and the repercussions only drawing more attention to himself and their organization. He would come to start abusing cocaine and alcohol, which would only shorten his temper and amplify his attacks, which were not even just on his enemies but people around him. Due to his drug addiction and inability to get a hold of himself, Faustin's empire would appear to be deadlocked, no longer progressing or growing, but frozen. It could have been around the same time that Dimitri would have developed his addiction to painkillers. Both clearly had their vices, and rotted the success of their business in their own ways. Where Faustin saw enemies and insults that were to be met with a swift bullet to the head, Dimitri did see opportunity to grow and fund their ventures. But because there were two men on the opposite spectrum of dealing with things, I think it's fair to say that it's quite possible that Dimitri's personal need for survival would bleed over into feeling this empire was equally, if not more, of his than Mikhail's. If he was here from the beginning, continuing to oversee the business, and is the only one out of the two willing to do whatever is necessary to ensure the business continues to grow and survive, why would he not feel entitled to it all underneath? If Mikhail already seen him as weak and spineless, even acknowledging his double-sided nature of taking credit when it benefits him but not doing the same by taking a share of the blame when something bad might happen or might look negatively on him, as he clearly does so here.
I've angered people. Me? Not we. Strange. When I give out the money, it's us. When I have to push people, it's me. All alone. Don't think I cannot see through you.
Add this to his submissive, calculated mask that he wears around Niko, and it becomes even more striking when contrasted against Faustin's erratic, explosive behavior. It's a performance that serves him well, both short and long term, especially because it appears he does intentionally set Faustin up to overreact. Remember, these are two men that have known each other for decades by now. Despite Faustin spiraling out of control, he's still sound of mind enough to see the game Dimitri is playing and to call him out on it. And that game is Dimitri appearing to be the logical and more agreeable between the two of them. Similarly, Dimitri knows Faustin well enough to push his buttons to make him overreact. And it doesn't take long for us to see what Faustin's trigger is. It's being told what to do, or to even be told to calm down. He snaps at Dimitri multiple times, following Dimitri pleading with him to calm down, the very wording that sends him over the edge. And we know it's not just a reaction specifically to Dimitri or whatever Dimitri is talking about, because Faustin flips out with Niko here when he tells him the same thing.
They statue says we are brothers for life. And now he betrays me. You didn't give him a choice. You should have been calm. No one, not Dimitri, not anyone tells me to calm. You think Dimitri would have survived prison without me? He'd just be some prison queen had I not been there. Meat for some chin monkey!
But what truly sets him apart isn't just his temperament, it's the infrastructure that we already covered to some degree. The moment Faustin was completely taken out of the picture thanks to Niko, Dimitri didn't just immediately inherit that power, he instead stepped into a system that he helped build as the sole proprietor of that infrastructure. A network of businesses and criminal channels that were built under Faustin's name, but sustained by Dimitri's silent labor, all became his. What Faustin left to rot, what he neglected, mismanaged, or simply refused to acknowledge as a valuable asset, Dimitri would later exploit. Territories that had gone dormant under Faustin's erratic leadership were revived. Smuggling routes, faded contacts, and forgotten corners of Liberty City's underworld were pulled back into operation, and slowly the fractured remains of Faustin's crew began to merge with the more established operations under Kenny Petrovic. Two Russian mobs, once separate and on peaceful terms, now fused under one large banner. It was leaner, meaner, and far more efficient. Now it's possible the two mafia families didn't merge. However, even if they didn't, Kenny's supposedly powerful mob man that was feared, or at least appeared to be feared by Dimitri, is never brought up to any meaningful capacity again. Which does bring up a question in of itself. Was the threat from Kenny Petrovic really as big as Dimitri claimed it was? Now, I'm not saying the possibility of all-out war wasn't real between the two families. It could have brought ruin between the two of them, but when Niko even suggested to Dimitri just running, after all he doesn't have any family here, Dimitri just responds that they'll find him if they wanted him bad enough, which doesn't make sense if you already made it clear to Petrovic that Faustin was single-handedly behind the death of his son. It only points more in hindsight to how he just wanted Faustin out of the picture, waiting for the right moment to get rid of his friend with an expendable asset, which Niko was, on grounds that made sense to everyone. Faustin was killed for the sake of all-out war, not him being slowly pushed over the edge by his second-in-command to then be eventually betrayed and having his empire stolen from the very person he believed was too spineless to do anything without him. Although his entire miscalculation in that scenario wasn't the fact that Dimitri was spineless, it was mistakenly thinking he could do anything successfully without Faustin specifically.
You know, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we must obey the rules of the game. We can pick the game, Niko Bellic, but we cannot change the rules.
With Faustin gone, Dimitri's new empire reached unknown heights of success. He wasn't just reviving long-gone channels or just breathing new life into what Faustin had been before, but instead expanding into every level of the city. At the heart of all of it wasn't just cocaine and heroin, but blackmail and extortion. These weren't all just products, they were the foundation of Dimitri's brand new empire. His entire business model pivoted around them, and anyone foolish enough or desperate enough to align themselves with him only accelerated that rise. But it wasn't just small-time pushers or corner-level muscle that Dimitri took advantage of. It was names that mattered, primarily the Ancelotti crime family, and later, the Pegorinos. That should say enough, considering the Ancelottis and Pegorinos had been locked in quiet hostility against each other since the early 1990s, each one of them trying to push the other out of Liberty City's crumbling mafia hierarchy. Not to mention, by the time they aligned themselves with Dimitri, bloodshed was a common sight between these two families. The Pegorinos, as a matter of fact, even hired whatever remained of the Irish mob to help carry out their hits against the Ancelottis. Jerry McReary would later in the story hire Niko to not only take out high-ranking Ancelotti capos, but would even dress him up as an Albanian, to make it look like there was some kind of inner fighting between the Albanians and the Ancelottis, which was an interesting move considering the Ancelottis were working with the Albanians in their own desperate way to combat the Irish mob and the Pegorinos. But even Ray Buccino, a well-known associate within the Pegorino crime family, would hire Packy McReary to rob an incoming cash shipment from the Ancelottis. The rivalry between the Ancelottis and the Pegorinos was only one side of a much darker, more dysfunctional picture though. If it had been just about the Pegorinos, maybe it would have stayed contained, but it wasn't. The Pegorinos weren't even considered a legitimate family by most of the old guard. Jimmy Pegorino himself was seen as a clown, a man desperate to be taken seriously but lacking the pedigree, the muscle, the respect, or any kind of real vision. And yet the Ancelottis couldn't put them down. That failure said a lot. Out of the 5 mafia families operating in Liberty City, the Ancelottis had always been whispered about as the weakest. Their inability to wipe out the Pegorinos turned whispers into open mockery. But even then, that was not the end of it. At the same time, the Ancelottis were fighting a second war. This one was against the Messina crime family, a much more dangerous opponent, and if that wasn't reckless enough, they were also encroaching on territory controlled by the Gambettis, the strongest and most respected family in the city. Surrounded, outgunned, practically bleeding from every direction, and yet they still tied themselves to Dimitri. It could have been out of greed, it might have been out of desperation, but whatever the reason, it sealed their place as pawns in a game they never had the power to win. Beyond the cocaine flooding into neighborhoods under Gambetti control, which was an offense serious enough to draw the Don's attention, it was Dimitri and the Ancelottis' foray into blackmail and political manipulation that would mark their most ambitious gamble, something we see from various perspectives. Niko's first introduction into this, for instance, is through a seemingly surface-level operation, where Dimitri's men attempt to blackmail Liberty City's mayor, Bryce Dawkins, through his secret relationship with Bernie Crane. The scandal wasn't that Dawkins was gay, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The issue here was the hypocrisy. Bryce was running for re-election on a platform built on so-called traditional family values, publicly denouncing homosexuality and presenting himself as the face of conservative moralism. Behind closed doors, however, he was sleeping with Bernie. It was the perfect target, politically explosive, personally compromising, and ripe for leverage. But it also revealed how far Dimitri was willing to reach. This wasn't just drugs and guns anymore, it was image control, election tampering, and extortion that went much deeper than that. As it would later be revealed, the goal behind blackmailing Bryce Dawkins wasn't just scandal for scandal's sake. It was yet another very calculated strike aimed at undermining one of the oldest power structures within Liberty City, the Gambettis. For over 50 years, the Gambetti family had quietly maintained a stranglehold on the city's infrastructure. Public contracts, sanitation, bus lines, window cleaning services. Mundane on the surface, but massively lucrative behind the scenes. It was a silent agreement between the family and the city's elites, and that's what Dimitri wanted. By blackmailing Dawkins and forcing those long-standing contracts to be opened up to public bidding, Dimitri and the Russian backers saw their opening. If they could must-win, legally even, they wouldn't just embarrass the Gambettis, they'd cut them out entirely, stripping them of their oldest, most protected assets. And with the Ancelottis bleeding from all sides, the Pegorinos viewed as a giant joke, and the Messinas distracted, there'd be no one left to oppose him. Dimitri would have had an iron grip on the city, and it might have worked had it not been for Niko. It was Niko who intervened. First, by stepping in to protect Bryce Dawkins from Dimitri's blackmail scheme, shielding Bernie and diffusing the leverage Dimitri thought he had. That would just stall Dimitri's plans. What would truly help it collapse, along with the multiple hits at the Ancelottis alongside Jerry, Packy, and the Pegorinos, was Niko's cooperation with John Gravelli. For those that forgot, John Gravelli was the head of the Gambetti crime family, and one of the last old dons who was still managing to pull strings from his hospital bed. He and Niko would orchestrate a final counterstroke that would permanently put Dimitri in check. Niko was asked to help a contact of Gravelli's by the name of Bobby Jefferson. Bobby Jefferson was a powerful man who was well respected, and unlike Gravelli, he actually held a genuine title. He was the ex-secretary of security enforcement, who was heading down to Liberty City under the guise of giving a speech. His message? It was a stark warning about rising organized crime and the dangers of unchecked immigration within the city. But it wasn't just rhetoric, it was a targeted warning aimed directly at Dimitri and the Russians. They knew Dimitri would do everything in his power to make sure Jefferson wasn't able to deliver his speech. And they were right. Jefferson's motorcade would be attacked by the Russians while en route to the venue. It was an attack that was thwarted thanks to the help of Niko. The timing of all this was far from a coincidence. With Dawkins' scandal neutralized and federal eyes suddenly turning toward the Russian syndicate, which was only amplified by their attempts to kill Jefferson before he made the speech, the cracks within Dimitri's seemingly powerful empire was beginning to show.
What's the problem? Me and you's partners now. We're back on top.
I didn't work this hard to share the spoils of a victory. Goodbye.
Despite building on the foundation of what he and Mikhail have created, possibly all the way back from the 90s, much of Dimitri's power and subsequent strength during the duration of Grand Theft Auto 4's story could be a tale of growing too fast without properly anchoring yourself. Unfortunately, we're never given too much insight into the exact details or the understanding the Ancelottis and Dimitri's Mafia's alliance was based off of, but from the main story and what we see in the Ballad of Gay Tony DLC, the Ancelottis were far from a strong position. It wasn't until after Gracie Ancelotti was returned to the family, traded by Niko and Packy in exchange for the diamonds from Gay Tony's possession, that the Ancelottis would finally fade from Dimitri's climb. Their usefulness by that time had apparently run dry. And in the aftermath of Jefferson's anti-crime speech, as federal pressure began closing in, Dimitri turned toward a new ally from the final stretch of his power play. This was Jimmy Pegorino. Pegorino's failures as a mob boss are way too many to list here. He'll be the focus of our next GTA video, but for now, what matters is this. He was Dimitri's final victim. No matter which ending you choose, Pegorino loses. It really doesn't matter here. Agreeing to work with Dimitri only seals his fate because whether it's Roman's death that pushes Niko over the edge, or a different betrayal entirely, it ends the same. Pegorino becomes a loose end. A man with nothing to offer, and Dimitri makes that clear, shooting him dead and admitting he never planned to share anything with anyone.
What's the problem? Me and you's partners now. We're back on top.
I didn't work this hard to share the spoils of a victory. Goodbye.
A snake to the very end. Dimitri's final move wasn't a masterstroke, it was pure desperation. It was a last-ditch effort to avoid what had been coming for a long time, a bullet to the head. And in that desperation, the mask he wore for so long, one that made him look cold, calculated, all business, finally slipped for good. He's the most hated character in Grand Theft Auto 4, and deservedly so. But hate alone doesn't explain him. He was written with enough depth and contradiction to make him worth revisiting. On the surface, he came off as logical, composed, again, all business. But listen closely to the way he taunts Niko throughout the story, the phone calls, the threats, the smugness he has. There's clearly a level of pleasure in the control he wields. And that's not fantasy, he had genuine power within his own organization, enough that even Niko for a time stayed away, even if it was only out of respect for Roman, who begged him to let everything go. But Dimitri never knew when to stop. The more he got, the more he pushed, and it was the obsession with control that came with total disregard for anyone that got in his way that would eventually bring Niko back into the fight. When Roman was kidnapped by Johnny, which wasn't even a random occurrence, it was orchestrated by Dimitri, thanks to Ashley owing him money and agreeing that in exchange for kidnapping Roman, as a way to get at Niko, he would soften or clear her debt. It was just another bargaining chip to him, yet another small pawn. And it only continued with the Ancelottis, with Jimmy Pegorino. That was all Dimitri's flaw. He never saw people, he only ever saw leverage. And when you treat everyone like they're disposable, and when you never know when enough is enough, eventually someone comes back to return the favor. Had he waited just a little bit longer, possibly for John Crivelli to finally kick the bucket, then he could have swooped in. If he sat back and wasn't so aggressive with taking over the city as quickly as possible, he might have made a better choice of realigning himself with other, more powerful mob families that weren't deadlocked in a seemingly endless war, eating away at manpower, money, overall resources, and just the prestige within the criminal section of the city that still had some kind of respect. He was a victim of his own greed, and just as Mikhail Faustin warned Niko that Dimitri would betray him, he also said the American greed got to Dimitri. It poisoned him, just like a disease. Thanks for sticking around to the very end. It means a lot. I'm curious what you think Dimitri's biggest mistake really was. Was it aligning with the Ancelottis, moving too fast, too recklessly, or was it simply turning on the one who built everything around him and thinking Niko would easily go alongside Mikhail? Let me know your thoughts. And a special thank you to the amazing supporters on Patreon like Konkin and Ryan Smith. You help make these deep dives possible. If you too would like to get early access, behind the scenes content, and help videos like this continue going, feel free to check out the Patreon linked in the pinned comment. But even if you just watched and subscribed, I appreciate you all the same. Thank you.